I was going to say that we were actually on time, but we're not.
Yeah,
It's one minute
sorry,
past 10.
I was off. Good morning.
I don't think we're ever.
Well, as long as we're not really promoting this thing and nobody's watching the live version of it, does it really matter?
That's true.
It's
Good
just a
morning to you
philosophical
too.
question that, if a, what is it again? If a tree crashes in the woods and there's nobody to hear it, did it
Does
make
it
any
make a
sound?
sound? Yeah,
Something like that. Is that the one?
it is something like that. Have you got your coffee?
I
Got
have
your
my coffee.
coffee? I've got my coffee. We're ready then. Season 2, episode 14. How did these numbers keep running away with me? So today's question
I have
is
a lot of episodes out. Okay, today's
we
question,
do
straight to it.
straight to it. Today's question is quite a long one.
Okay.
So but I think it's an interesting one.
Cool.
Is there a personality type to have to work in communications? A way of being that you should have to blend into the sector? Is there a place for both extroverts and introverts?
It's a good question. Actually, there has been at least one article about that I know of.
Oh wow, I wasn't
Yeah, I know
expecting you to
it's
say that.
it's a topic. Well, the fact that it's raised as a question doesn't come from nowhere.
I
It's a
felt like this
concern.
question came out of nowhere. I didn't
Well,
realize it was a thing.
it
Like
is
you
a
had to
thing.
be a certain kind of person to.
Yeah, it's a thing. But it's not just in the world of communications. Okay, so of course, there's going to be a lot of different ways to answer this one, and I'm not sure by which way I'm going to start. But I'd like to say no to begin with, and
Right.
hopefully somehow finish
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah.
But as a matter of principle and belief, and rather than necessarily, anyway. So some of the tropes, and this is not just communications, but I can talk about communications. But in the world of work today, the professional environment seems generally to favor the extrovert.
Yeah.
The loudmouth,
Yep.
the person that speaks the loudest or the most, or is the most
Yep.
confident at the meetings, which is not always immediately tied down with being introvert or extrovert, but tends to be. Or at least, yeah, that tends to be the case. Now, I mean, we could have and we probably will have some side of the conversation that is entirely dedicated to, maybe this is better to start straight into the question. I'm also thinking, I'm wondering if some people get bored of dilly-dallying for several minutes before get onto the question. But anyway, now there's a lot to be said, I think, about personality and psychometric tests.
Yep.
And this is, I've not read this, but I was reminded that I have not, and that I should, because it's also very used in my line of work. And I'm reminded in the Joseph Campbell, A Hero with a Thousand Faces, because he refers to, the work is very steeped into Freud and Jung, early precursors to psychology, psychoanalysis for Freud, and what's it called? Jungian
Psychotherapy.
Yeah, but Jung has got there's another name attached to it's a certain kind of psychology that he invented. Basically, they're the early days. I mean, they're some of the precursors anyway. But I was going to go with Jung's archetypes.
Yes.
So he talks about human archetypes.
Yeah, he does.
I believe he was the first one to talk about the idea that people can be split up between being extrovert and introverts. And then a lot of that work was picked up and developed in further by Myers-Briggs, Myers and Briggs, two psychologists, to create their famous 16 personalities personality test. Now, I'm not an expert on those, but I'm going to comment on, I know of them. I know them. I've used them but I've used them in the case of being able to talk about brands in a certain way that allows to talk about categorization.
I've got some opinions about that as well.
I have a lot of opinions. I'm sure you'll be able to share that. So, and we both do the Gallup Strengths, which is also another, it's a very different kind of psychometric test or a different kind of perspective. But it reminds me of the conversation I had with Jim Collison, who is their podcast host that for my podcast. And any of those tests are, to me, only useful insofar as they are a way to look at how you function, and a way to look at how you are and how you function, and not a label to say this is who you are.
Yes, very good. Totally agree.
Yeah, because then you're boxing yourself in rather than
Yep.
using this as a way to consider an outside image that allows you to look at yourself.
Yep.
And one of the tendencies with just the simple, simple, and it's not that simple. Even if we could easily spend the hour, and we will, because that's the question. Just on the dimension of extrovert and introvert.
Are you familiar with the Ocean
I don't think I
personality
am.
test?
Wait, tell me. I think I've heard of this, but I'm not
So
sure.
the Ocean personality test is one that's has a
Is that
lot.
4 criteria? Is used in
It's
HR a
5.
lot? 5?
It has
Maybe
a
I'm
lot
not
of
thinking of another one.
validation, a lot of support. So Ocean is openness,
Mm-hmm.
C is conscientiousness, E is extroversion, A is gone out of my head, and N is neuroticism. Now those 5
I think I know
those
this one, but I'm not sure.
yeah, those 5 have been used a lot. But they're not just used in HR. I did go to a really brilliant Star Wars exhibition at the O2 in London about the world of Star Wars and identities in Star Wars, exploring identity and the alien races and the characters. And what they did was they linked all the characters, the big characters in Star Wars, and all different kind of main races that you see to this personality test. And I've got a really big book all about it. It's fascinating. Now, this whole world of personality and identity is a really big thing for me because I always felt like I never
for everyone.
for everyone, but
Sorry.
I always felt like I never fitted in because of
Yeah, I
not
remember
being
we
part
talked
of a
about that before.
majority culture. So it's really interesting that people are thinking certain personality traits are valuable in certain jobs, whereas you are like I think you make an interesting point about the traditional extrovert tends to be the confident, the person who speaks the loudest tends to be the person who's recognized and all of that jazz. And I do think it overlaps with some more traditional masculine, feminine qualities as well. Like guys will be the ones sometimes who are willing to ask for the pay rise, to say what they think, which means they get noticed more, which means blah 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 blah. There's a lot of that, and we have talked about that. I think.
Yeah,
When we talked about male, female in the workplace, I think we have.
Did we in the
episode.
question that all men are trash?
Yeah, that was season
Which was
1.
the question was, sorry, just for anybody who hasn't seen the question was, is the phrase all men are trash offensive?
Offensive. Yeah, that was season 1, episode 19. That was. So it is an interesting way of, I totally agree with what you're saying about personality tests. Psychometric tests are useful as long as they don't become a label, because then it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You see what I mean?
Which is how most people use it.
Yeah,
I think, because we're looking for answers about our identity, and we keep talking about all the time in every episode about knowing oneself.
Mm-hmm.
And an apparent shortcut to knowing oneself is to use an external validation system, which can be a psychometric test,
mm-hmm.
the astrology chart. I'm not joking. To me, those both have So honestly, there's a lot of work when you dig into how the psychometric tests were put together. You're like, well, does this really have a lot more validity than an astrological chart? Because the astrology charts are typically, I mean, they're vague enough and specific enough to match a lot of like, oh, I tend to be like this in some situations. And honestly, you read the results of the psychometric test, go to 16 personalities or the ocean one. I'm not familiar with I can't think of the ocean one right now. And you're like, well, wait a minute, it says the same thing. I'm exaggerating, but not by much. This may well be very controversial to some people, but hey, I mean, if we're not going into controversial territory, we're not thinking new stuff. I like to think that. Anyway.
I agree with you. So do you think there's certain personalities then within communications?
Yeah. So I wanted to go back towards that. So if you remember the conversation that we had, and I would encourage people to go check it out, even though it's incomplete and we can talk about this for hours, what does it take to succeed in the communication field? Which was an interesting conversation. But one of my main points, I'm sorry if it sounds like a little bit of a cop-out, but is that the communication field is vast. There's a lot of different types of jobs that take different types of personalities. And also, personality is not, even though we might think that,
Yeah.
Personality is not dedicated to a certain type of job. You can be various personalities and get the job done, whatever the job is.
Yep.
Which is different from, and this is a little bit more on the, which you know because you've been trained in that, and well, I know a little bit, but the Gallup Strengths thing, they like to say that it's not about the strengths that you have, because that's for anybody who doesn't know, that's a test. It's another psychometric test where the simple idea is that we spend a lot of time worrying about where our weaknesses. What if instead we identified our strengths, and they codified and identified like a number of 35 strength themes? They still call themes?
34 strength.
34,
Yeah,
sorry.
themes, talents, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, themes, talents, anyway, and you do the test and it tells you what your strengths are. In short, we can talk about that for another hour as well, I suppose. So I'm not going to dwell on that one just for now. We're going to come back to it. But my main point was that the strengths don't tell you, and the results of any test don't tell you what you should be doing, but tell you maybe the way to approach the things that you're doing, how you do them.
Oh, when you say what, you mean like a job or a career or a?
Yeah, I'm talking about yes, but I was less specific because I think it matches for anything. It's not just the job; it's any kind of venture or part of your life.
Yeah. And too often people want the answer.
Yes,
we want to know, what do I do?
Yes.
Oh, I'm supposed to do this.
But yeah, because we want to know what to do because we don't know.
Yeah.
Now the hard truth is there is no answer out there, and when you're young, you're like, well, surely the adults have got figured it out, and I keep saying it. I wasn't listening when I was younger, and you, like anybody younger or students listening to us, is probably not going to hear it either. But the adults have got nothing more figured out than you do.
Yeah.
The ones that believe that are deluded or lying or both or something else or hypocrites. I don't know. But generally speaking, they don't. Or the other way to well, this is a slight tangent, but this is what it's for. I would imagine, and I don't know this for sure because I'm usually willing to say I don't know. Anybody who believes they got things figured out is because they set themselves in a certain way of living that is comfortable for whatever the size of it is, like whatever the routine of it is, whether it's adventurous or whether it's like staying in the same, whatever their comfort zone that they've explored. They're like, this is what I know. I'm comfortable with it. I'm not going to go further afield very much. And the more you do that, the longer you do that, the more you feel like you've got things figured out, because you're not going to find out anything too new or too extravagant outside of your comfort field. And
then the interesting thing, I think the interesting thing about becoming like that is that learning stops.
Yes, which is the case of the vast majority of human beings. I'm exaggerating, but not by much. I mean, the vast majority of people have got their, they got their responsibilities and they're going to work to feed their kids, and they're tired at night, so they just watch TV, and they got their convictions, their beliefs, their things, and they might do something a little bit going out of their comfort zone or going out of its comfort zone is not incorrect, but I mean, just their usual way of living. And it takes something to put that back into question. And not now, there's a lot of people that do, but there's a lot of people who don't.
Yeah.
Or who do with varying degrees of frequency. And I think we all know some people who seem like they've settled in very early on, even in high school, like this is who I am, this is what I'm doing. I'm not going to go further afield.
I remember.
And I don't mean further geographically. You could decide to go on vacation backpacking every year and still be like this. You probably extended a little bit your comfort zone if you go to a different country you've never been to, but
traveling does broaden your horizon and your comfort zones.
Yes and no. I mean, you can go travel and you go to the same resort and make sure that you get all the comforts that you have exactly the same at home, and watch the same TV show and just have a bit more sun in a swimming pool at the beach.
Yep.
A lot of people do that.
Yeah. I remember when I went to university, that was kind of a seismic shift for me, where I realized I'm not limited. I could be anyone I want to be. There was no, because nobody knew me. So I could effectively invent a whole new way of thinking and who I was. And that's kind of what I did. Yeah. And it was that, but I enjoyed it. And then I remember when I went to university, I was clean shaven. and I didn't go home for a term. And then my mum, my dad, and my sister came to see me at university, and it was the first time I'd grown a moustache. And I opened the door, and my sister's face was like, because she'd never seen me with a moustache or facial hair. And it's things like that where you start.
Well, those are the times where you're experimenting, just
Exactly.
you're out of, that was your first time being out of the house, so you're different kind of environment, and you're at an age where you're coming out of your teenagehood and you're kind of like working out who you are as an adult. For
Now,
some
how
people
often
it comes early, and I'm still working it out, obviously.
how often do we have those kinds of experiences as we get older? But not very much. Everything becomes set, and then we become limited, in my opinion.
Typically,
We limit
yes, not
ourselves.
always, but yeah.
Yeah.
But to bring it back to the question, there's another preconception that, so if I do any tests, I tend to be considered as an extrovert. You too, or no?
I tend to be extrovert.
Yeah. And and everybody's gonna like, oh, of course. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you talk out of your loudest person. There's a lot of correlation, but not necessarily.
Yep.
And equally, the fact that you're an introvert doesn't mean that you can't speak and that you don't speak in a meeting.
Yep.
I know a lot of people who are podcast hosts who are introverts. That's not, so there's a few things there. So in the communications field, again, there's a lot of different types of roles. I discovered through the Sweathead group of Mark Pollard, who launched it, but who's now a big thing about strategy. And through, actually, that was not the only one. And it's interesting because I just joined a group of people in France, and we're looking at doing a survey of people who do our jobs in France. So I'm translating a bunch of previous surveys in which I had participated or helped crunch the data for international strategist surveys. And I discovered through a bunch of people sharing on groups over the years that, and particularly there was a few things in Mark Pollard's Sweathead group on Facebook, that there seemed to be a high or an over-index of introverted people who worked in strategy jobs.
Interesting.
And who felt that they were not listened to quite a bit, and or felt like it was difficult for them to speak out or to say something. Hence the kind of, there's at least one post that I can find again that was talking about like the fact that you need to listen to introverts a little bit more, and there's too much of a problem in the communication field and the business world in general of attention going to the person grabbing it, and that tends to be the loudest, and it was what we were saying earlier, and that tends to be the extrovert. Now, I also, there's another misconception that the extrovert is also extremely sociable, but that we're all on a spectrum of introvert and extrovert, and it really depends. You know, there was another famous post that came around, and it was based on a book. So there's a whole book that I believe came around on this idea that we usually think of the introvert as the reserved and shy and quiet person, the extrovert, the loudmouth that speaks a lot, has a lot of friends, maybe a little bit like the jock or the sports guy, but or the clown, maybe like somewhere in between that. But they recodified something which is a very interesting idea. I also don't think it's actually based on anything more than the idea. But some of the most popular beliefs and convictions out there are based on observations that don't really run very deep, actually, you realize. This idea that if you're an introvert, you regain energy when you're with others. If you're, an extrovert.
When you're with others, no, when you're by yourself.
Sorry, what did I say? If you're an introvert, you get energy back when you're by yourself. You spend energy with other people. When you're an extrovert, it's the other way around, which is a super interesting idea. I don't think it's actually, I'm not sure it's based on that much research. I have doubts.
Well, it's
from what it's coming from?
From what I've read,
because I know there's a psychologist who wrote it, and it's like that idea's taken hold big time. It has. But I don't know how much research has gone into the theory.
The theory is,
but this is me questioning everything.
And I'm a bit skeptical too. But the theory is to do with how much stimulation there is going on in someone's brain. So if someone is more stimulated or has more internal stimulation or more going on, they tend to be introvert because they prefer to have time by themselves, because being around other people is like too much. Whereas an extrovert might have less going on and require more external stimulation, which tends to come from other people and being around other people. That's the basic kind of idea. I can't remember the reference or who said it or what it was, but
No, me neither,
that's what
but
I've read.
I know there's a book anyway, my skeptical second on the side, and sorry for like questioning within questions
No,
and everything, but
that's
um,
questioning everything is good.
yeah, that's what we do here anyway.
This is what we do.
Kind of the idea.
Yeah.
I need to stop umming. That's one of my projects that I fail at. I've been podcasting for 6 years and I'm still doing it a lot.
I'm amazing at not umming.
You're really good at that. Is it teacher training?
No, I just discovered that I could do it. I don't know how. I do notice though that I say "and" quite a lot.
You replaced it. Yeah. We always have filler words.
Yeah, but I'm aware of it. I think and this is a whole other tangent.
Very different tangent. Sorry.
I think one of the things that's allowed me to do it is doing lots of videos by myself. So on my Instagram at JamesDeSouza76, I do a 1-minute video every Monday. And because I hold the camera and I film it, I've got used to not saying I think that's where it first started. I don't think it's anything to do with teaching, although who knows?
I remember talking to people about my podcast at the beginning of it, so 5-6 years ago.
Yeah.
And talking to people, but I mean, in an event, I was talking to people who worked on the radio.
Oh, okay.
So I was asking them and they were like, well, it's, just don't say it. I'm like, is that it? That's the whole advice you have for me? They were like, yeah, instead go silent, train yourself. I'm like,
yes, I agree.
I still don't understand. It's a conscious effort, and as soon as I lose it, so anyway, I should do something else. Should so do purposeful training to do that.
Breathe. That's what I do. I'd breathe.
Okay.
Or actually, the other thing I do is I look at it. I'd make a face. I'd be like, all right, that's what I find myself doing, especially when we're talking. I don't know if you noticed. I do this to make myself sound like.
Well, I go in and out because I look at my camera and I look at you and and then sometimes I watch back some videos and I'm still not clear exactly where I should be looking at my laptop screen so that it looks like I'm looking into the camera.
I look at the camera a lot, especially when we're recording. Especially when
I try to do that, so I'm not looking necessarily directly at your face, is what I was meaning to say.
I know, and I have to flick between the two, but it is the thing. Certainly, doing online teaching, where looking at the camera makes a huge difference to the people's experience
as much as possible.
So but anyway, introversion, extroversion.
Completely. So back to extroversion and introversion. So what I wanted to go with my skepticism is to remind ourselves that we don't know where a lot of our beliefs come from. This is something that we repeat. Mm-hmm. And similarly, not to diss that theory, but I don't know what research it's actually based on. There's a lot of human sciences, behavioral psychology, and psychology in general that is based on not that much.
Yeah.
Sometimes becomes popular and you're like, well, this now is something that everybody believes, even though actually the origin point is 2 bits of research with 20 people.
Like the left brain, right brain thing is utter, like, what?
Yes. It's better. There's another reason why it's better to think about extroversion and introversion on a spectrum anyway, is that it depends. I am more of an extrovert, but I am also, interestingly, somebody who's built my life to be a very solo operator on most things. I do things on my own. And so I do get a lot of energy back from being on my own. I do also get a lot of energy back from being with a lot of people, depending what the situation is like. And I know it's really not useful to create because so I say we human beings, people want to understand. So in order to understand, we want to simplify some things.
Model simplify.
And my brother-in-law makes a lot of fun of me because I'm always like, well, it depends. Look at this situation and that situation. And then it's not useful anymore because people are like, well, I want the answer. So it happens to me a lot that, yes, I would be considered a lot more of an extrovert, but I do spend a lot of time on my own, even more so in the past year. And I need that time to regroup myself, to go and expend energy to be with other people. But other times I really need to be with other people to get inspired, to have conversations, to have dialogues. And I think a lot of introvert people would feel the same, but depending on a lot of other aspects of your personality, you might prefer, like, you really, really want to be with other people, but maybe just one person at a time, where you can have like more of an intimate, deeper kind of conversational relationship with someone, rather than being at a party with 50 people.
I agree.
Not that we've had a lot of parties with 50 people for the most part, unless exceptions, but even me, that it's like considered to me myself to be pretty extrovert, I've not had a lot of that going on.
I totally agree, because I'm the same. I get in from teaching, a day of teaching, and Davina, my wife, will start talking at me, and I'm like, I need time to play some guitar or meditate, and then I'm like, okay,
Yeah,
right, I'm fine. Whereas she is like always on, like.
well, so that's, you can either think about that on a spectrum, but also just as a, you know, things are balancing,
Yeah.
swinging one way or another, and whatever your level is, at some point it swung too far on the other side, and you're like, okay, I need to draw back a bit.
But the key, we keep saying this, but the key thing for me is knowing myself, to be able to say to Davina, I need 5 minutes by myself. And she knows it. She knows when I come in from work, sometimes I can be really edgy, and she knows.
Yeah, but that's a tough one, because
Yeah.
we want to, well, depending on whatever else is driving you, what mine is like, I want to be nice, so I'll just say yes to things even though it's not working for me. But this is taking us in a very different territory, although not necessarily.
No, not
But
necessarily.
let's bring it back to the communications field.
Right.
So there's also there's also, I guess there's a what was I going to say? I was an understanding, I suppose. If you're working in communications, you should be good at communicating, which is, there's a lot of people who work in communications who are very bad at communicating. Now, this is also very difficult because it's to the appreciation of, there's no official scale or scientific scale to say whether you're good or bad at communicating, and it really depends on the situation.
What's interesting, surely, in your job is that, yes, there's being loud, being in a meeting, coming up with ideas, all that kind of thing, but there's also how powerful it is to put together a document that communicates ideas, that gets things done.
Yes,
and
but that doesn't have anything to do with whether you're an introvert or an extrovert.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was going to say, because I think the power of written communication is underestimated. A one-page document that can put across ideas really, really well, that allows people to take action, is a form of communication, I think, that is massively underestimated.
Yeah, and underutilized, and people are not trained enough for that. Yes, absolutely. So the best way to improve that kind of stuff is to write and to read more. But and I would say read good stuff.
But do you think, no? So you made a really interesting point there that I totally agree with. That being able to write your ideas and communicate them effectively has got nothing to do with introversion, extroversion. And another bit of the question was, is there a way of being that you should have to blend into the sector? Do you think there's a particular kind of...
So I do believe that I think it's important to bear in mind that there is a usual understanding, as I said, I'm repeating myself, in business and in communications, that it's better to have something that looks like an extrovert type.
Okay.
Again, the speaking loudly, confidently, being confident, but I also believe that you can be confident and introvert or extrovert. It doesn't really have any bearing on anything. That's where the idea of where you get your energy is perhaps a more useful perspective than imagining that the introvert is reserved and shy. Because I think you can be, well, extrovert and reserved and shy, or you can be very extrovert and loud and looking like you're confident, where in reality you're extremely concerned with what people think of you, which is also what happens a lot with any kind of human being. So it's so tough to say. Because it really, really, really depends. And any kind of assessment that I'm making on the industry is based only on my experience, even though I've seen a bunch of places, a bunch of countries, a bunch of agencies. So one could argue that my experience is more valid, but there's tons that I haven't seen because I'm only one person. So my experience is limited by my experience, and you're necessarily making generalities. And I do not like making generalities to answer the question, but it's difficult not to answer the question without making them. So in my experience, what matters the most is, as you said, I think learning how to communicate effectively so that you can put across and talk about, and that is something that you can learn whether you're introverted or extroverted, or whether you think yourself like that or identify yourself to be that way. Look at where your strengths are regardless. So for example, if you have trouble speaking about yourself in an interview setting, that's something that you need to work on somehow. To look at how can you ease up, how can you be able to more confidently talk on a one-to-one setting, because that's like key, super important. Regardless of whether you're nervous or not, it's normal to be nervous. But
what about in a meeting?
Well, wait, I just one last time, because otherwise it's just let me finish on my idea. We're not going to get progress on anything otherwise. I'm the one I know that usually go in tangents, but no, but where I wanted to go with this, one way or another, if you want to get into the communication field, before going into generalities about what happens, particularly for the students that we're talking about, you're going to have to get in. To get in, you have to go through an interview.
Okay.
So that's one way to get in that I'm talking about, hence the one-on-one. We'll talk about meetings in a second. So
and what you're saying is one-on-one, being able to talk about yourself and your ideas one-on-one.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Because you begin with an interview at some point or another. You might have more than one person in an interview, but we'll get to that. But I do have a point I want to get to before we talk about group meetings, because I'm going to forget so the point is, what matters the most is who you're going to work for, and to get an idea of whether that person is going to be a good person to work for, and they have a good environment of work. As a manager, as a person to report to, that matters way more than what's going on in the rest of the communication field, or ultimately whatever your career is. And it can be a tough one to balance out. And I've talked about this several times with my students over the past year, some of them going for interviews for internships, etc. It's tough to balance out with, and this is for anybody in any career, it's difficult to get a really good idea of the company when you only have one or two interviews with a person. Very difficult. It's very difficult to gauge what a company is like when you're looking at their website. It looks cool, but I know from experience, the website can say a lot, and there's a lot of very different stuff that actually happens in the office. And where it's very difficult to balance out is how much the company that you're interviewing for weighs in the balance. So if you're interviewing for a very big company or an important one, or one that would weigh a lot on your CV or resume if you do work there. So if you have a choice, or that's another thing, sometimes you just have one offer, you don't have multiple ones. But to look at, but it's still an interesting, I think it's worthwhile in the question of being introverted and extroverted, to be great in one, to be considering and listening and asking questions about the person you're going to work for and their team specifically, because that's the environment that matters the most. It's very difficult to gauge, but if you start having an eye for what are the questions that I need to ask to get an idea of the kind of person I'm going to be working for, then I might be able to get an inkling on what is valued there.
Yeah.
And what is valued there, only that the loudest person gets to say, and this is the way we go. Or is it mixed, or is it let's say extrovert person, but that listens to everybody, or etc. So I wanted to make that point that I think is valuable for a lot of students or anybody who is going for interviews, because there's a lot of people that happens at any given time.
No, this is good, because Gallup's research shows
go ahead.
That relationship with your line manager, with your boss, with whoever you're working with, determines probably the biggest part of your happiness and success in your job.
Yes.
And the thing I'm getting from what you're saying is being good one-on-one and being able to ask good questions to try and figure out how you can fit in, or how you can best show what you're good at? Does that environment welcome you and the kind of person you are, and is that likely to get the most from you? It's very challenging to judge before you're
Very
in that
challenging.
environment.
Very,
And
very challenging. And there's a whole dimension
that's
of
really
like, how do you
important.
judge whether a person is going to be a good person in an
Is
interview?
so great. So great what
Because
you're saying.
you ultimately have to, I mean, it's like so some of it's usually said that the three areas that are the biggest sources of upset or like self-judging, or feeling vulnerable because you might be rejected, and they're important parts of your life, is anything to do with love and romance, relationships, housing, and jobs. So those are moments where you're looking for a house, you're looking for a partner, you're looking for a job, that you have to make decisions based on very little information most of the time. Visiting an apartment, no, it
This is good.
depends.
Yeah.
But I've read this in a bunch of places, and it's so true that you're like, oh, I really love this person that I had a date with. I really love this job, or really love this apartment. There's a high chance you might not get any of those.
They're also
You
really
know,
stressful events.
there's a stressful events, stressful environments, because those are very important parts of being able to be set and comfortable. And by the way, let's circle back to what I was talking about living a comfortable life that is set. I didn't mean to diss that. It's very important. We need to have our bearings and our comfort zone. We need to know, well, work is a part of belonging. It's part of expression and fulfilling oneself. It's part of like knowing that I have enough to live. It's part of development of like growing into an adult. And typically there is that. Living is, well, where do I have a roof over my head, and am I living in an environment that works for me? And love and partnership,
and that's the foundation that allows the exploration to happen. If you got
all
those things,
again, just to repeat that point, none of these are based on whether you're an introvert or extrovert. If you consider yourself to be very introvert or very extrovert, you might approach those differently. But whether you are one or isn't, it doesn't have any bearing on whether you should or shouldn't be in the field. So that's joins back my original saying, like, no, it doesn't have any bearing. Now, yes, those the traits that are stereotypical traits of being an extrovert tend to be over-considered. And let's say if you are in an interview or in a meeting with a very big company but the person in front of you is obviously like, I don't think this is going to work with me at all.
Mm-hmm.
But you're offered the job, and this is a company that really, really, really is going to matter a lot to your future if you have it on your CV. Well, that's up to you to decide if that's worth the hit.
And
you're making I think putting yourself in an uncomfortable position for the sake of the value of what you're going to have on your CV, or the experience, just to have the experience, may well be extremely worthwhile. But I can't make that decision for you. But those are the kinds, but the questions and the things to look out for are still the same as what I was talking about if you're looking for a good person. Is to think about, okay, when you're preparing for an interview, what kinds of questions would I like to find out to really try to get as much possible information about who this person is, whether they're going to have time for me, what their team is like, what they believe. And you don't necessarily know, but at least it gives you an aim to try to find out about things.
You're making
you know what? You can also, very simply, it would be a really interesting question to ask that line manager.
Yeah.
What do you think of extroverts and introverts? Do you think your team is more extroverted or introverted? Like, how do you consider both? And there's a lot of people who go, wow, I didn't expect that question. That's very interesting.
But this points to the really, really powerful point that you're making about an interview isn't just about the company finding out about you.
Yes.
It's also your opportunity to find out about the company. And even, I mean, like a date is really obviously two people trying to find out about each other. But in an interview, it can feel like they are trying to find out about you rather than you trying to find out if you will fit in with them. It's an exploration on both sides. So this going back to your point about being really good in a one-to-one situation is valid in so many different ways. If I'm searching for like a flat, a house, or whatever, the questions I ask whoever's telling me about the place are going to be really important. I think there are so many situations where asking great questions and listening is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
incredibly powerful.
And yeah, absolutely. I'm going to give you another one. So when I had a short stint of working in sales and recruitment in London, and it's a big industry, and it has a reputation for being, for anybody who doesn't know this, for being a really quite hardcore sales environment. It's considered to be like, you know, up there with trading on a trading floor.
Yeah.
And the references, so it's like hardcore sales, and you get all the tropes from being hardcore sales, which do go very strongly with being an extroverted, being a little bit like fast and loose, having the references of the movie references that were told, and that's where I watched for the first time, The Boiler Room and Glengarry Glen Ross.
I haven't seen either of those. I know I did see them. Yeah, I know.
So I hadn't seen them when I showed up, and everybody was like, "What? You haven't seen The Boiler Room and Glengarry Glen Ross? You need to watch that." And Alex Baldwin's scene in Glengarry, so they're worthwhile movies to watch for anybody who's watching this. Glengarry Glen Ross, which is about old salespeople that are being pressured. There's a big speech from Alex Baldwin who shows up, and it's A, B, C, always B, closing.
Yeah.
That whole speech.
I've heard about it.
The breaks are for closers, and there's the whole speech is on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
That's what these guys admire that I showed up with. And that's the environment that I'm in, that to be able to sell, you need to have all that, which correlates strongly with the extroversion type, right? And that if you don't do that, if you're borderline dishonest, or if not completely dishonest, you know, all that stuff, all the stereotypical really bad image of the hardcore salesperson, and grating to me, as in that speech from Alex Baldwin. You watch it, you're like, oh, you are not a nice person. I don't want to be around you. I do not like you. And the guy is purposely in the scene going, you don't like it? That's it. Like, I got a big car, I got a big watch, I got all those things, I got the fancy suit. You don't have it because you're a loser. And until you step up to be like me, you won't have all those things that you want. Now, I would go in a place to justify my own feeling that is very different from that kind of environment. Even though I'm an extrovert, I don't like confrontation. There's a lot of people who don't. And I think human beings in general don't. You train yourself. Well, some people are trained to personality-wise to like that more. But there's also just, it feels threatening. On one hand,
so you worked in an environment like this for how long?
So I'm padding a little bit the opening just to give you a little bit of background. And I was 27, 26 when I worked. So, you know, not that old. Not that old. And it tends to be a young people job, not only, it was a small company, not only young people, but not very old either, to be honest. A few a little bit older people, but not like mid 30s perhaps. And the owners were early 40s, I think, sort of, let's say. Well, I forgot one point I wanted to make before I get to the next one.
Was it about the experience you had when you were there, what it was like, the conversations you had?
It doesn't matter. It'll come back to me. So
introversion, extroversion as well. Because I can imagine that environment, because we had someone who worked in that kind of environment talk to the pupils in my school.
I got my thread.
And it was very target driven.
Yeah, totally. It's extremely target driven.
Yeah.
Driven by results, driven by goals. And while the kind of character like Alex Baldwin or the super hardcore salesperson, I feel threatened by, on another hand, if you ask me, like, do I want the fast car? I'm going to go, no, I don't really care. But that's my point is, I don't like to think of myself as that kind of person.
Yeah.
But I like nice things. I might not want the exact same nice things that person has or show them in the same way because I think that's vulgar.
Yeah.
But yes, of course I want nice things. Of course I want to succeed. Of course I want to reach my targets, whatever they may be. Of course I want to reach my goals. I like to think that I want to reach them my own way. So that's what I did. That's where I was going with it. So I started working there at my own rhythm. I did my own thing. And this was after I worked in coaching and personal development, and we talk a lot about knowing oneself. It's a never-ending process.
Yeah.
But just to point out that I have a lot of training in, I was trained in public speaking. I was trained in coaching. I was trained in listening. I was trained in a number of things. But so I had some assets on getting to know myself, even though, by the way, I had done a few interviews at other recruitment agencies who had turned me down based on my psychometric tests to say that I didn't have the right profile to be a salesperson.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so
Wow.
I did, and one of them, I don't know, was a 4-point thing. I can't remember what it was, but so I think I can find it somewhere. I have it. I also scored pretty badly on conformity, something like that. Like I don't conform, which is kind of like not very surprising. So some people are like, yeah, I don't really want you in my conformist team. Exactly. So I was told by 2 agencies and that I didn't have the right type. I was too nice, too much of a nice guy to be a salesperson. 6 months later, after starting at this job that did accept me, and my whole goal was they were recruiting. Well, I was told, by the way, this is another one for interviews. I was told, and they had on their website, that they recruited for the advertising industry and for digital marketing.
Okay.
So, and I believed them when they told me that in the interviews. I was still 26, And then I showed up, and I showed up on my first day of work, and they were like, yeah, actually, there's not really, they didn't say it like this. But I quickly figured out that there was not an active anything going on in the realm of the department that I wanted to recruit for. They had a database of old leads, but nobody currently actually actively recruiting for the industry who could take me on or under the wing it could be.
Okay.
So I went from close to scratch to recreate not a department, but a sector to be recruiting for that had been worked on before by somebody who'd worked there in the past, but not at the moment. So just
practically from nothing, you're recruiting for an industry for which they have very little information that they told you that they were
old
doing.
Leads.
Wow.
That they told me that they did. Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Generally speaking, sort of.
Yeah. Yeah.
By the way, this is not uncommon at all that things are going to be represented in a certain way in the interview, and you find out that life is very different when you actually work for the company.
I had a very similar experience in
and if you look back at 22. Your experience, if you look back, you're like, did they lie? Not really. Misrepresent? Yeah. Very much so.
Yes.
But also maybe the person hiring you has no idea what you're going to be living through. It's entirely possible too. That happens.
Everything you're saying chimes with my own experience when I was looking for a job after university. A similar kind of thing where it was like a data analyst position for a marketing agency that I went for, and I didn't realize, but I was like 23, 24. They needed someone really fast. They wanted someone who's good at Excel. The guy who interviewed me wasn't the person I was going to be working closely with. It was all like, looking back, it was very agency, very like shoot from the hip, go for it, get it, make it happen, blah, that kind of thing. I remember that I got home from the interview, they biked me over a contract that day. Like they wanted someone super fast, and I didn't realize what it meant at the time. I was like, oh, okay, I'm getting a job. Yeah, they sent me over a contract, and I read the contract. It was like, cool. And of course, the recruitment agency had put me forward for that. And then when I got into it, it was very like I was super duper under pressure all the time, and that role actually got taken over by another company, and I ended up moving companies in 18 months. But I had no idea what was happening all around me. I was like, I'm glad to have a job.
Yeah. And was that a company and a job where it was more extroverted or introverted, and which one did help you do that?
I think that the people who were managing me were more extroverted, and the people who were higher had more time to think, so they seemed like they were more introverted. Like I remember my manager's manager, she was very considered, didn't say much, but she was the kind of person when she said stuff, everybody like hung on every word. And that's either a more introverted way of thinking, communicating, or it's an extrovert and this is purely my opinion, or it's an extrovert who's trained themselves to get people to listen. Is that what I'm saying making sense?
I think so.
So it was a time in my life where every day I felt totally out of my depth, totally, for like a significant amount of time. Like we're talking 6 months to 18 months. I was like, what is going on? So
By the way, that tends to be a normal feeling if you're working in a lot of different industries, but communications in particular.
oh wow, really?
I would say yes. I mean, it depends, but it tends to move very fast. A lot of people don't have time to explain to you. It's like a sink or swim kind of thing. You're thrown often in the deep end and out of your depth. So there's a point where things can become more comfortable, but they're not going to be comfortable for a long time.
So, and just to
they
say,
might not be, or at least you need to develop or have a high degree of comfort with the unknown and a lot of things that are moving fast around you that you don't really have a handle on. Now, again, it really depends. I'm making a generality. Did you want to add
I had
something?
very little
I'll
context.
finish my story afterwards.
Yeah, because it was a media planning agency. That's where I was working.
Yeah.
So it was. Oh, you reminded me about this. I've forgotten all about that.
Yeah, media planning moves fast, and agencies tend to move fast. And
Yeah,
these days, you're working for an agency or hired by a company that wants you. Let's say, because a lot of interns would have that. And I'm paraphrasing something I've recently heard from someone. A company might hire you because they want to have, as in the communication department, which is there is none, to do social media, because they want to sell more stuff and they see this as an avenue, and they're like, great, I'm going to get some interns who are savvy with TikTok, Instagram, and whatever, and they're going to do stuff that go viral or whatever, something along those lines. Give them a phone, or just not even give them a phone, ask them to use their phone, and and hope for the best. And a reminder again that even though the person that is on the young side, that may well be more our audience right now, because we're talking about interviewing and interns, etc. Adults, or the person hiring you, doesn't really know. And one thing that a lot of people are bad at is to determine and spend time thinking about what it is they want. So hence, a lot of people go in and they have no brief. They have nobody's like precisely asked them what should be done. They also don't really know what kind of person they really need for the job, because they're not clear what the job is. Now, nobody's going to admit that to you, and it's entirely possible they don't even know that for themselves, because a lot of people operate like, I'll know it when I see it.
I'm kind of laughing,
but ultimately the bias that
totally
decided whether to hire somebody or not is nothing to do with their abilities to the job, but something to do with the way they smiled, or the fact that you have a hobby in common. That happens a lot. So I had a lunch catch up with an old person that I had placed. Actually, let me finish because it's late. My quick story on the sales environment. So 6 months into the job or so, I think, we were having a drink with my colleagues, or I think even just like smoking a cigarette on a cigarette break. And two of them were laughing, and then they said, okay, well, we've got to come up straight with you. We had a wager when you started as to how much time you're going to last here, because there's a big turnover in recruitment. A lot of people don't make it past the probation period, or very little past the probation period. And 6 months after I started making money, I started getting some commissions in and putting sales. It took me 4 months to put sales together, because it takes a while in recruitment. Get things going. And so they told me that they were like, nobody believed in the team that I had the type that was required, of the kind that aggressive sales, outwardly probably extrovert type, and that I was too nice, that I wouldn't last. And they were impressed, and they were like, okay, well, I have to apologize. So, plus it's kind of funny, but we had money, mostly all of us, against you. And you proved us wrong. So we're like, we don't know what you're doing and how you're doing it, but you're not doing it in any kind of way that we're used to. And the way that I was doing it is, and this takes a lot to do it your own way. And I was able and trained. So I have to also mention that I was definitely thrown into the deep end, but I was also trained in my previous job to be extremely autonomous.
Yeah.
So I was very autonomous and resilient. And when I was given like a computer, a database, and going like, you do whatever you want, here's the commission structure, I was like, and the only other training you got is pick up the phone and cold call. I'm like, oh, okay, I'll do that. Which I did before in my other job. So I was also, I had a lot of training for speaking in public. I had training in sales. I had training in a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, being on the phone, talking to people, creating
So I did not
connection.
have anybody like, so, and then I worried about trying to find the best candidates and doing a good job for the clients and the candidates and being, and really focusing on the relationship. And I was like, if I worry about doing a good job for people, it'll turn out the right way. And funny enough, that person that I'd placed into a job contacted me, or like posted something about gratitude and tagged me for the job I found them 15, 16 years ago.
Wow.
That I had forgotten. And we were friends on Facebook, but I met the guy once or twice. And he's French, lived in London at the time, because that's where I was as well. Is back living in France. I knew he was in France, and I think we'd exchanged messages years ago. I mean, you know, I don't really know him, and I forgot about that. But what I didn't know or realize was how much of a huge deal it was that I found him that job. And he's grateful to me forever, because he showed up in London. He had a bad experience in France of being a little bit of a misfit and not being able to fit in. And he thought maybe he could find something in London, but he didn't really speak English. And I did have a bit of a specialty at trying to find candidates who didn't know how to write a CV. And somehow I was like, I think this guy is really good, but they don't know how to talk about themselves. And he also told me that it seems like the probable reason he got the job at the time was that for whatever reason, the person interviewing him got locked onto the idea that he had one of his interests on his CV was a martial art that the other guy practiced as well.
Wow.
And he really liked that. And that was like, that ultimately was what made the difference between him and other candidates. You never know. So at first I was like, he's like really grateful to me. And I'm like, great, I don't even remember. He's like, oh yeah, but this is what happened in the interview. So it's entirely possible it's not even you. I'm like, okay. So it's a combination of different things that you don't really know what's going to happen. And in that case, did it have anything to do with that guy being an introverted or an extrovert? Not really, because it did have to do with him practicing a martial art of some kind that he didn't really practice all that much either. So the guy after he started the job was asking him, and then after they realized that he didn't really speak English. So anyway, all that to say, I think that yes, there's a huge over-index to extrovert, because it tends to be taken for the loud person, and the loud person has more, there's an imagined perspective that's more difficult for the introverted or the shy or the reserved person, and easier for the loud, and it's true to a certain extent. But I think we're getting to the end of the conversation. I wanted to circle back to say that it's something to be aware of, but there's everything else that we said, I think is hopeful to have a lot of different avenues to explore, because it's not actually true.
Yes.
I don't know if there's anything else to say to wrap it up, because I can go on for a while, but
I think it might be worth.
There's also just seeing, and you keep entertaining that thing is believing it. So there's also a point where I'm like, I don't even want to talk much more about it, because the more you talk about it, the more it solidifies this idea of the loudest person or the most extroverted person is more considered. And it's not always true. And
no, it's not. There's maybe three other things that might be useful. So there's
when I could have said a lot more about the communications field as well, but there's a lot we said in that other question that we were first to. So
yeah, I think it's relevant to the communications field. So
sure.
but also jobs in general. But one of the things I wanted to mention was like Myers-Briggs was very much Myers and Briggs coming up with a theory and then finding ideas to match their theory. Whereas the reason I like the Gallup Strengths is they collected all the information and then started to build it from the ground up based on the patterns they found. And I think that to me makes it more interesting and compelling. Certainly
Yeah.
that thing. And the other thing I like about the Gallup way of thinking is that it's more uplifting. It's more about what are you really brilliant at and doing more of that. And then I tend to get myself in trouble when I overdo one of my strengths and it starts to negatively affect the people around me. That's when I know it's not that I'm weak and I like that reframing. I think that's really helped me get a handle on like when I'm being a complete idiot. It's usually because there's something that I've totally missed or that I'm overdoing and I can get a handle on it really quickly. And ultimately, all of these models, they're just simplifications of reality to understand. And as much as they're useful, great. If they're not useful, find something else. And I think that it's really apparent from the way you speak about communications, how much you really like it, but also how varied and how much space there is within the whole industry. And I think
there's so many different types of jobs and different types of industries, and how one team functions is going to be very different from another. So it's really difficult to say. But what is one thing that's for sure, and I think we gave a lot of directions for that.
Yeah.
Is, and I think we're both passionate, so we're biased on that standpoint anyway, is that learning to know yourself and better communicate is going to be useful whether you work in the, well, certainly if you work in the communications field, but it's useful if you work in other fields.
I think I would also, the other thing I think there's a theme going through everything you're saying is how powerful listening is.
Yeah.
And how it's, yes, it can feel like this having something to say is important, but listening to what someone else is saying can be just as, if not more powerful, because that gives people the space to be able to express something. And when you've been really listened to, or when you're around someone who's really listening, it's a really profound experience because it doesn't happen very often.
Yes.
And I think that's as much about communication as talking.
Yes, absolutely. And being younger, I was often under the impression that I needed, or that I wanted, or that I knew the answer. Also, that tends to be one of my things, to like be a bit of a know-it-all, or a lot of a know-it-all. Sometimes. So to believe that I need to come up with the answer, or that I need to say stuff to be impressive, and sometimes it's kind of true, but sometimes it's not. Or at least I've dropped a little bit more of the idea that I need to absolutely say the smart thing in the room, or to participate in the conversation. And because it's so, and I don't know, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. Maybe sometimes I didn't say anything in a meeting and people said, well, he's useless, just get rid of him. I don't know why he's just not bringing anything to the table. What I mean by that is I can't control what other people are thinking. Because I could open my mouth and people go, well, that was stupid. But I cannot control what other people are thinking. I can control and learn how to communicate better and be okay with who I am. And that's an ongoing process. Even though it sounds lofty to say being okay with who I am, there's a lot of what we're talking about ultimately, isn't it?
It is. And it's a great place to end.